next speaker I'm delighted to introduce and invite in a moment on stage is Dr. Stephen McDonough. He's Medical Director, UK and Ireland with GSK, and he's going to address the theme of the role of industry in medical education. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen McDonough.
So good morning, everyone. It's a slight departure, obviously, so I feel bad I put my tie on this morning now, but I did. I wanted to talk about medical education and really sort of moving on from the innovation. It's really my opinion that we, as an industry, have a duty to support medical education, so we should be supporting medical education. We discover, we invent, we develop, we produce, we market products which are used by healthcare practitioners for patients. So we should have a duty to help with the education around those products. We should be the experts about those products. But we get a lot of criticism as well about our involvement in medical education. And it seems to be fairly easy to criticize us. So I want to kind of have a look at that to see why do we have that criticism? And with that criticism, what can we do about that to try and alleviate some of the worries about our involvement in medical education? And also on that, to think about, well, it's not just industry that should potentially be changing its ways of working. It's healthcare professionals as well. Their ask of industry, their role as a physician, sort of working with industry. How do they look at how they interact with us as well? So talking about physicians, I thought, well, I'll start on this. This is, I thought, I'm looking for a little bit of a theme to go through. And this is Titian's The Three Ages of Man. And I thought, well, this kind of represents my journey through industry. So I started off on the right side here as really quite a young cherub. And as a young cherub, I was working as a hospital doctor. And then also working as a general practitioner in the UK and in Australia. And I interacted with industry, and industry provided education for me in different formats. And I always thought, well, I'm not biased by this in any way. In fact, sometimes I don't even remember which company it is that's putting on whichever event it is, because I know the speakers, and the speakers are giving me a broad, balanced view of what's happening. So you know, I did interact with industry in those days, and I was aware of negative publicity about industry, but I thought, well, you know, I know what I'm doing. I keep an eye on unbiased sources. So if I then move over to sort of, this is me joining the pharmaceutical industry, so my second age of man. And once I joined the pharmaceutical industry, it was a bit of an eye-opener. So, you know, physician in practice, joined the pharmaceutical industry. And the eye-opener was, first of all, how regulated it actually all was. So the codes of practice, how actually seriously that was taken by the industry, and how actually the people I work with did have patient benefit at heart. It wasn't just about business. There's a commercial side to industry as well, of course, but actually it's very well regulated. But also at that time, I started attending overseas congresses really for the first time. Remember, I'd been a GP before, didn't really get a chance to get out that much. So I went to overseas congresses, and I was quite blown away by the kind of the sheer scale of those congresses, the amount of business that was around those congresses, the stands that go up, the healthcare professionals who were supported to go to those congresses. And it was quite an eye-opener to me about how these massive scale events were happening and what was going on with them. So I'll touch on that in a minute as well. And here's me at the back now, sort of old man. I think I'm kind of getting towards that. And I suppose my role now, I've worked across different countries. I've worked looking after Asia Pacific, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, UK, Ireland. Spent a bit of time here as well. And actually, now I get more involved in kind of the policy aspects of medical education. So asking the questions about what should we be doing? Why should we be doing what we do? And maybe with those policy aspects, I get exposed even more to kind of criticism of what we're doing. And there's criticism from lots of different sources, but this is a potential one. So is the relationship between pharma and medical education on the rocks? So this was a while ago. So what are the potential biases that pharma brings to medical education? Are there conflicts of interest there? Are the people who attend those medical education forums, are they fully aware of those conflicts of interest? So those are the sort of things that, you know, we have discussions about how can we work with that. And then, of course, you know, up to very, very recently, pharmaceutical marketing to doctors harms our profession and our patients. So that's quite a headline. So our marketing, of which there is education, our marketing is actually harmful towards the profession and towards patients. And I suppose it is, a negative headline is a more exciting headline, and people certainly make their own careers on being critics. But with every piece of criticism, there is some element of the truth. So how do we look at these sort of criticisms and say, well, what are we doing to try and make things as transparent and open as possible? And how do we move on from that? But not least, I know so my company and other companies have had fines for what they have done in the past in terms of marketing activities. How do we move on from that and actually be very open and still support the medical education piece that is so important to us? So just looking at the Congress piece, so looking at congresses, congresses are this multi-faceted business, but as companies, we still, in several countries in the world, are permitted to invite healthcare professionals directly to congresses, and we can provide flights, accommodation, subsidence for them to be at those congresses. So is that something that we want to do? Is that something that we feel is sufficiently detached from individual influence for healthcare professionals? So I was reading in the Wall Street Journal, just as sort of preparation for this talk, about the advent of changes in the States around continuing medical education and the funding that goes with continuing medical education. And funding did dip a little bit, but it's gone back up again. And there was some discussion around, well, is this the right thing? Is this not the right thing? But it's always very interesting in those sort of articles online to go and read the comments that come in afterwards. And there was one quite interesting comment which said, I hark back to the days when pharma supported a medical congress which was held in a ski resort. And you go to the lectures at 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock in the morning and then go skiing in the afternoon. Wasn't that wonderful? And I suppose that wasn't wonderful. That shouldn't be what it's about. That shouldn't be something that a pharma company could support, and it certainly wouldn't be something that could be supported within our rules and regulations at the moment. But for a healthcare professional to think that that might be the right way to kind of combine leisure with education, perhaps on their own time with no extra funding, that might be okay. But do they, for example, get study leave to go and do that? Does that look like the right thing to be doing? So I think those sort of, we need to kind of grow up that relationship a little bit. Not that we support those sorts of things, but we're still supporting healthcare professionals directly to go to congresses. And of course, the Congress itself has evolved over time. So if you think back to the sort of 60s and 70s, large international congresses were the way to learn about cutting-edge developments in medicine and all the new innovations, and to talk to your colleagues. Well, the internet obviously has helped that to be a much more of a real-time activity, but there's still definitely the need for congresses. But is there the need for so many congresses? Is there the need for so many which have become a kind of a business in their own right? I think it's interesting to hear about the late-breaking data at ASCO. That's the right place to bring that. But lots of people can get that online as well. So what's the role? How does this evolve to be something more digital? So I talked about the States. In the States, they're quite, what happens in the States often comes to different countries afterwards. Well, the ACCME, the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education, is really the place that they start to have they have an arm's length relationship with industry for providing continuing medical education. So the ACCME makes sure that there's a firewall between those industry funders, essentially, but whoever provides the education. So industry can't have a role in designing what's on the agenda. They can't invite people directly to it. They also cannot know who has attended in case you kind of use that afterwards to go and try and influence. And that's a really quite restrictive way of continuing medical education. But one of the things that the ACCME did was that they did a review to see whether actually there's any evidence that industry funding of medical education leads to bias. And they couldn't find evidence in a systematic review. But so I suppose the absence of evidence isn't the evidence of absence. So the jury's still out. We still will get those criticisms about our role in education. And the European Council is also a European solution to this as well. But different countries have different regulations around this. And for example, in the UK, continuing medical education points can be given to an industry-designed meeting, but it's all on the strength of the agenda that comes with it. So just taking a step back then, what is pharma doing about that? So the ACCME kind of approach is one approach, but I just wanted to mention the Merck manual. So this is medical education at its kind of most basic and most original. So 1899, Merck manual first came out, so from Merck, obviously. And they've got an independent panel that puts this together, and then a peer review system as well, so 300 peer reviewers. So it's all about the independence there. It's all about the data and the independence, and that's it's something I used as a student. And then this kind of requirement for us to provide medical education, well, it's also part of the legislation as well. So we've got the risk management plans with the European Union. So quite often those will require specific education to healthcare professionals on the appropriate use of our medication. So it's not just us wanting to market, it's actually a regulatory requirement in some cases as well. And similar in the States with their REMS system, and this is just an example of long-acting opiates. So we've got sort of the regulators saying, well, there's some instances you absolutely have to educate. We also know that in our own industry-run meetings, so our promotional meetings, we've got strict codes of practice as well that really ensure that everything we do is accurate, balanced, and fair, and represents the latest data. So every country has its own code. There is an overarching European code and a US code, for example. The European code is quite interesting because it talks specifically about not disguising promotion as education. And I think that's something that companies can do to say, well, actually, when you promote, it needs to be clearly labeled as promotion. Of course, it needs to be educational. But when you support CME, potentially that should be the arm's length independent medical education piece. It's kind of a new emerging place. So what else will help? FPS code, disclosure. So disclosure of payments to healthcare professionals is another thing that's going to increase the transparency. So all payments made this year will be disclosed middle of next year. And that is a chance for healthcare professionals to say, when I work with industry and when I get paid by industry, that's going to be available to my patients and to the public. And that starts to drive the transparency. It's interesting that this comes from the industry. We invent the transparency system, and healthcare professionals are disclosed by us with their consent. It's not the other way around. So I think there's a role for healthcare professionals to decide if we're going to get criticism in this way, should they sort of take that forward and say, well, how will we disclose? And sort of good CME in itself, so this group, Good CME Practice, actually did a survey to see, well, what is good CME? And it's not really rocket science. So surveying out to their members, education's got to be appropriate, fair enough. It should have fair balance, absolutely. It should be transparent, and it should be effective. So if you're going to educate, then effectiveness should be a given. But actually, so often education hasn't been effective. And what it has been is more at this level one, which is come to education, we'll record your participation. We might see what your level of satisfaction is, but actually what we really want to do is improve public health. What probably we can aim towards is changing performance, so trying to make sure that the education is not only something that you come and listen to, but it's something that makes a big difference to how you practice and how you treat your patients. And so that's, as a company, we're trying to sort of say, well, we'll support educational processes and requests for education that are more around trying to show defined patient outcomes rather than just let's put another meeting on. And I think the patient outcomes piece is extremely important, and it fits very well with the 5-year revalidation of physicians. So physicians now need to revalidate, need to gather their points, but not just the point, but demonstrate that actually they are improving practice for their patients. So as a company, we've kind of looked at this and said, well, how do we move on ourselves to do something that's going to be more valuable? It kind of takes into account those conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest and works with those to kind of raise the standard of the dialogue. So of course I can only speak for GSK really in this, but we're going to continue to conduct our trials and advisory boards. That's a way of interaction. But the medical education piece, we're going to support in new and different ways. So that is trying to move more towards this independent medical education that is health outcomes driven or patient outcomes driven rather than just funding to run something. But also at that arm's length way of working that really takes into account potential biases that we might bring. And also the attendance of scientific congresses. So as I said, it's still permitted within Code of Practice to invite healthcare professionals to a scientific congress overseas. We think that's an important forum still, and a very important forum still, but we think that actually directly inviting someone to come to a congress is really too close a relationship. So how do we, and we're exploring at the moment, how do we work with third parties, whereby the third party potentially still supports the congresses and still supports really the needs of clinicians to meet together to discuss scientific advances, but removes any potential company influence on that, company ways of working. And of course, lastly, the other thing that we're doing as a company in our promotional forums is not paying healthcare professionals to speak on our behalf anymore, because we feel that that also is a potential conflict of interest. And actually, we have the expertise within the organization. We've developed the products. We know what they are. We have the expertise to talk about our products and to make that, to bring the educational aspects of that across. But make it very clear that when we talk, it's us talking. And of course, we have our own inherent biases. So just lastly, just to say, well, okay, all of this sounds wonderful, but actually, we know that health systems are having problems with budgets around the world at the moment. We know that here, the HSE is over budget for the first 9 months of the year. So where does the funding come from for medical education? So medical education is not just pharmas to provide. There are multiple different sources of this. But we'd expect that actually medical education potentially funded by doctors themselves. Why not pay for your own registration? But also funded by health systems who require them to work in a way that's of high quality and up to standard. So I think it's going to be kind of multifactorial ways of working, but the key to all of this is transparency and avoiding those potential conflicts of interest. And I'll maybe just finish there by saying, so my conclusion is I think we definitely have a duty to continue to support medical education. We have a need to make sure that it's as transparent as possible. And I think we need, as an industry, to listen to the criticisms, to not listen just all the negative criticisms, but to see the positive as well, to try and bring education on to being more outcomes orientated rather than just come and listen to this talk. And also, I think the other piece is for physicians to just change the way that they work with industry, to be clear about what they want and what they don't want from industry, and not just to criticize, but to support whenever there is value being provided by industry in terms of education.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Perhaps if I come first to you on this, Freddie Wood, because the whole context of this is changing radically, isn't it, with this EU directive, what do they call the Transfer of Value Directive. So the environment in which all this takes place really is becoming unrecognisable in terms of the practices of even a few years ago. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, yes, it is. And Stephen, just to give you a bit of background, I've been a cardiothoracic surgeon for 30 years and quite definitely involved with the device industry. And as you know, cardiac surgery has stimulated a huge device industry sector similar to the pharma industry. And there has been many concerns in relation to it. You highlighted very nicely at your last slide the HSE and its deficit. I'm sure you're aware that the HSE here funds entirely postgraduate education. Mm-hmm. And at the hospital level and at the ground level, there's certainly a significant lack of funding. Yeah. And my question is, while you've talked about the big meeting and the big international meeting, how can the industry support and fund postgraduate training at the ground level, at the hospital level?
I think for us it is about looking to say that when we support is going to be based around positive patient outcomes. So education from my day as a student has come on a lot in terms of trying to close that circle and saying, what does that mean in terms of what am I going to do for the patient, show what I do with it. So in terms of grant request, certainly as a company, we would look at grant requests and try to put that against criteria of what are the health outcomes, not just saying, well, we're going to fund postgraduate systems. And I think there is a role for industry within that, but industry's responsibility shouldn't be the postgraduate education of doctors. That should be with the postgraduate deans and with the health system itself. But there is a role for industry to help that, because I think over the years we have potentially created a dependency on industry for things like those international meetings, which is going to, in my view, going to have to change. That dependency will have to move away, and there have to be other sources of funding. So,
well, where I'm coming from, for instance, in the last 10 years before I retired as director of the National Service in the Matter, I ran 2 important multidisciplinary meetings, both breakfast meetings, one in relation to general cardiothoracic surgery and training, and the other in relation to transplantation. And I had industry fund the breakfasts.
yeah.
And because there was breakfast available, we really got a full house attendance every morning at 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
Now, when I retired, because of concerns by my younger colleagues about potential conflict of interest, even though they didn't sit on any purchasing committee or anything else, they decided to drop it with a consequent fall off in attendance. Where I'm coming from is that kind of
there's something about industry shouldn't just be there for the provision of food and support like that. So industry should be there. Primarily we're there because of our expertise to develop new products and to deliver those new products and to look at medical advances. So when we become just provision of food. But saying that, I think that sort of meeting is it is an independent meeting. You have educational content there. Industry providing support for that. It still doesn't stop industry providing a promotional meeting where we promote our products or we put a stand up for that meeting. And that for us is not medical education. The education component is the piece that you provide as the postgraduate centre. So those things are still acceptable.
Let me bring Frank Murray on this.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for your presentation. It strikes me that there are 2 types of meetings that I experience as a medic. One is the congresses, both national and international, which are absolutely clean and pure, and they all have support from pharma. And you can see that they're platinum partners and silver partners and gold partners and so on and so forth. And it's very much arm's length. And I think when you go to those sorts of meetings, you've got great faith in the objectiveness of the presentations. And you've also got a declaration by everybody speaking about what their conflicts of interest might be. So you were describing there, for instance, income from industry and so on and so forth. And I think those kinds of meetings are absolutely fundamental. And the idea that people would do those online, to me, it doesn't really work, because you go for a day or a day and a half or 2 days or whatever it is, you block out the rest of the things in your life. You've no patience to see, somebody else is covering your work. I think the idea that you do that online, it's very hard to see how people would do that. I honestly think that in the flesh meeting Congress is really important. I think they're quite different from promotional meetings. And everybody knows when they go to a promotion meeting that that's there where people are making a pitch about a product. And you bring very much your critical and analytical hat to that, knowing that that's what's been done. And many of the things that I found most useful at those meetings, and they're really important to go to because that's where new products are launched and you get a sense of where the product is going to be placed. And it's the discussion at those that's very often tremendously helpful and constructive. And in my job, everything I do is completely different than 3 years ago. Everything I did 3 years ago was completely different than what it was 5 years ago. And it's through those kinds of meetings that really you flesh those things out. Because when you read them in the journals, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion. I subscribe to several journals which I read religiously. But actually hearing them in the context of discussions among your professional colleagues and with some of the people who've developed and been involved in the medications or product or a kit, such as stents and so on and so forth. Those kinds of meetings, I think, are of tremendous value. So for those reasons, and I think one of the issues is how do you keep bias out of meetings? How do you make sure that there's honesty and transparency about what's presented? How do you control the kind of academic or scientific and the commercial biases? They're ongoing. They reflect the controversies you've described there in some of the cuttings you put up there, Stephen. And that's something that will go forward, I think. I think there's always going to be that tension between the industry trying to sell a product and the professional trying to get an idea of what's the best value for the patient. How do you put the patient first?
I think with those promotional meetings, those are absolutely, we feel those absolutely provide value. I think it's the piece about transparency in those, saying, well, those, that's a promotional meeting, it's developed by us. We do our very best to make sure those accurate, balanced, fair, all of the things that are in our codes of practice. But be clear that it comes from us. It's our data. Yeah. So, and I think those will continue to carry on, and those will be an important method for us to actually provide information about our products that is hopefully educational. I think the overseas congresses absolutely full transparency. They are independent. They are set up. Industry doesn't control what's on the agenda of those. You get asked to speak. It's all peer reviewed. I get conflicting views from different healthcare professionals. Some will say, I don't want to be there, I can do everything online now. So I'm kind of with you that there is a need for those meetings, but is there a need for so many of them? And is so many people going to those? Is that really the way it should be? And I think we as companies need to continue to support those meetings, because that's where a lot of scientific dialogue happens. But the support maybe should be done in a different way, which is something a little bit more at arm's length. We can still have the sponsorship and the stands, so that's very clear. You don't have to go to the stand if you don't want to. But the kind of taking people to a congress piece, let's do that a little bit more at arm's length, because that's a potential conflict of interest.
I mean, I think that's a very good point. I think that is a very good point.
I wonder, Stephen, as well, you're on the medical side.
Yeah.
Do you feel under pressure from the commercial side of the company to be organising these events? And are you sometimes feel, well, is this really necessary, but there's a commercial imperative in terms of what the company's objectives? Do you feel that pressure internally?
I don't actually. So this has come from the top in our company. So the CEO has said, well, we're going to change the way of working, and the chief medical officer together, so that from the board downwards, they want to continue industry's role to be able to provide accurate, balanced, fair information. But also they want to do it in a transparent way, and that may be because of our history as a company, but it's also our ethic as well. And I think that's the way things are going. If you look at what's happening in the US, that kind of arm's length ACCME approach, right. that will come as well. And that's also in Scandinavia in some countries. So okay. I don't feel that from the organization. I feel from the organization, with the changes that we've made, there is a certain amount of how is this going to work. Because it is, there are quite good changes, but actually as the UK and Ireland specifically, we've gone earlier with these than other countries in the world, because we think it can be done, and we think we can get to a new baseline. Okay, well, I think plenty of food for thought in your presentation and the exchanges we've had. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen McDonough, thanks very much indeed, Steve. Thank you.